Do we really need another Wizard of Oz remake?
Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam The Sands of Time. It's action and adventure in ancient Egypt in this terrific teen time travel romance. Get your copy of E-Steam The Sands of Time at your favorite online bookseller today.
Blackish creator and director Kenya Barris has been tapped by Hollywood to write and direct a new version of The Wizard of Oz. And I have to wonder if this version of The Wizard of Oz is absolutely necessary, considering that we've already had two adaptations of L. Frank Baum's classic novel, which was meant to start a series of books. Now, in 1939, we got what many consider to be the iconic version of The Wizard of Oz, which starred the late Judy Garland. And back in the 70s, we got another version of The Wizard of Oz, which was meant to cater towards black audiences, called The Wiz, which starred your Diana Ross, Michael Jackson, Nipsey Russell, Ted Ross, Lena Horne, Mabel King, and Richard Pryor. And that version is considered by many in the black community to be a classic film, and it was considered to be the first black fantasy film. Now, the reason why I believe that there isn't really a need for a Wizard of Oz remake is because the times have really changed. Now, The Wizard of Oz was a product of the late 1930s, and the story came even before that. So it's really a product of its times, and this film is over 82 years old. So I don't really think that there's a need for a Wizard of Oz movie because the concept at this point is very dated. I mean, the world has completely changed since the late 1930s, and what was considered to be big and grand during the 1930s is considered to be mundane in the 2020s. So this film's concept may not really age very well. I mean, the special effects, again, were considered a grand thing of its time, but in this era, it's not really considered anything special when we consider that we've got superheroes coming to life in movies like those in the MCU and the DC Extended Universe. And there's a series of diminishing returns on this Wizard of Oz concept, which really hasn't been bankable as of late. The first Wizard of Oz movie was a box office hit, making over $20 million on a $2 million budget in 1939. Now, if you adjust that for inflation, that meant that that film was a blockbuster in 1939. However, the Wiz that came out in the 1970s did not perform as well. Now, your Wiz, on the other hand, in contrast, underperformed at the box office with a $24 million budget and only made $21 million at the box office. And that was considered a flop back in the 70s when they made The Wiz. So there's a lot of risk making this film again. And this is something your Hollywood really isn't thinking critically about because many in Hollywood are afraid of going out here and taking a risk on an original concept from a screenwriter like myself. Now, many of these producers and executives in Hollywood, they want to go out here and get a sure thing, and many of them think that your Wizard of Oz is going to be a sure thing, not looking and thinking critically at the current world or thinking about previous failures as related to the box office. Now, just last year, your Hollywood went out here and spent $100 million on a film similar to The Wizard of Oz, and that was Steven Spielberg's West Side Story. And this movie, even with a prominent director like Steven Spielberg, couldn't even generate $10 million at the box office. And the main reason why it couldn't generate $10 million at the box office was because this concept of West Side Story was extremely outdated, and this concept was offensive to one of the core audiences that the film tried to appeal to, the Hispanic community. Now, the Hispanic community took offense to West Side Story and considered the whole concept of your West Side Story to be a racist one, and that's why a good chunk of the core demographic refused to go see that movie. Moreover, many Americans over the last 50 or 60 years no longer have a love for that movie, and many people who were a part of the millennials, Gen Z, and Generation Alpha, they don't really care about West Side Story. That film is a product of the 1950s, and it's a piece of time. Now, the other thing that is detrimental to this whole Wizard of Oz concept is the fact that it is in a genre of film that is not one that is very profitable these days. Now, the musical has never really been profitable ever since the late 1960s, and it's a big budget movie that really doesn't pull in the numbers. So Hollywood, in trying to play it safe, is ironically taking major risks, because you've got an outdated concept, you've got a musical movie, and musical movies have not been performing well at the box office. No, recently we've had West Side Story flop at the box office, we've had In the Heights flop at the box office, and a Wizard of Oz movie could be a trifecta as related to box office failures, as related to musicals. Now, these musicals are, again, big budget productions, and making this type of film could be a huge failure for whatever studio goes out here and takes it on. Now, the other part that makes this a big problem for the studio, as I see it, is the fact that they're tapping an inexperienced director to go out here and direct a big epic movie like The Wizard of Oz. Now, your Kenya Barris has managed to hustle as related to shows like Blackish, and his style of self-deprecating, self-hating, as I see it, comedy. Yes, that's good for television, but with a production like The Wizard of Oz, I don't really think he's qualified to go out here and write that kind of screenplay. You really need a seasoned screenwriter to work on that kind of screenplay, and I doubt any seasoned screenwriter would even want to touch this material, because the material is extremely outdated, and the whole concept is one that wouldn't work in a 21st century world. So when I look at your Kenya Barris, I think he's in way over his head trying to write The Wizard of Oz, and I also think that he's not a fit director for this kind of film, which had really huge visuals and has a huge cast. He just doesn't have enough experience as related to this kind of material, and I believe he's in way over his head, and I believe that he would actually put touches in this screenplay that would actually ruin the material. Now again, when they're Blackish, your Kenya Barris was notorious for going out here and presenting the Anthony Anderson character as one of these self-hating black guys who really just was out here looking to appease and gain the validation of white people, and it really wasn't very funny to watch. So I really don't think he's really going to be the right guy for this kind of project, because he lacks nuance and he lacks skill at doing very interesting scenes. So he really doesn't have that depth or that skill set as related to this kind of project, and he's not a really good fit based on what I've seen as related to Blackish and his really self-hating kind of comedy. And I also really think that his ability to work with the camera isn't very good. So I'm looking at this project and I'm seeing a major disaster for whatever studio decides to tap him for this project. So I really don't think he has the skills for this project, and I also think he doesn't have the writing skills to pull off this kind of film. Now, if this were somebody like a Kevin Grevioux or a Sally Richardson Whitfield, I could see them doing a Wizard of Oz adaptation because they have experience in fantasy and science fiction, and they have worked on these kind of concepts before. But I really don't see your Kenya Barris doing this. I mean, I see him making a film similar to The Wiz, and The Wiz had a series of flaws as related to it, as related to production, and that really hampered the production. But the whole thing is that when I look at the whole Wizard of Oz concept, again, I believe it's an old concept from the 30s. It is something that really does not need to be remade. We've already got 2 adaptations, and again, Hollywood is already dealing with diminishing returns on this concept. So this is why I believe that we really don't need a Wizard of Oz remake to try to be fresh for the 21st century, because this is a 20th century story, and it needs to be left in the 20th century with Judy Garland's iconic performance and Diana Ross's iconic performances left to be the classic performances that they are. I believe that Hollywood needs to stop going out here and trying to remake old films and start going out here and start producing new concepts like I produce at SJS Direct. I believe it's time to start going out here and working on some fresh and new original stories that will relate to audiences of today. And I believe it's time to create some new characters so that people can go out here and have their own stories. I mean, what's really troubling to me is that here in the 21st century, kids today don't have their own characters like I had growing up. Growing up, I had, in the 80s, we had our own movies, we had our own stories, and those stories were unique and distinct and our own. I mean, in the 80s, we had our own characters in movies like Last American Virgin, Beetlejuice, Commando, Predator, The Terminator. I mean, there were just so many different characters, and we had our own characters and our own stories. And I believe it's time to let this generation have their own characters, have their own stories, and stop digging in the past and trying to remake old films, because each film that's out here needs to define its generation, and it's time to let the kids of this generation have their own unique and original stories, because what we're doing is continuing to try to relive the past, and that's keeping us from seeing a greater future. And this is the other problem I'm having with Hollywood, is that there is no real vision for the future. And because there's no real vision for the future, many of these creators just keep going back to the past, keep trying to remake old concepts, keep trying to remake old stories, and not thinking about trying to create something new and fresh. And they're not wanting to create anything new and fresh because they're afraid of failure. And this is something I talk about in my book, The Man Crisis. Many of these men who are running Hollywood, a lot of them are beta males, and they're scared of failing, so they don't want to take a risk on anything new. They don't want to take a risk on anything fresh. They don't want to take a risk on anything original. Meanwhile, their grandfathers, they had no problem doing this during the 70s, and that created many of the iconic and classic films like Godfather, Rocky, Star Wars, Love Story, and many other films. Unfortunately, the sons and grandsons of those executives are filled with fear, because everything is about trying to pander to audiences. And when you try to pander to audiences like Kenya Barris did with Blackish, you get a guy who's coming from a position of weakness. And when you come from a position of weakness, you're not going to get strong material. And that's another reason why I believe your Kenya Barris just isn't qualified to go out here and make a Wizard of Oz movie, because he doesn't have the confidence that he should have. And I've seen that from many of his projects, like your Blackish and other projects he has worked on. He just doesn't have that confidence, because every time he makes all of these projects, like the show Blackish, and it was another show he had made, like Mixedish and Oldish and other shows like that, and Black AF, he just shows no real confidence, and him being a self-deprecating, self-hating black person. I know that the version of The Wizard of Oz would come across with filled with self-hate, and all of that self-hate would be shown where every black character, if there were black characters in this movie, would basically be there trying to pander to white people, defer to white people, and acquiesce to white people, and it wouldn't be an entertaining film to watch if you're a black person, because he always goes out here and has everybody looking, black people looking weak on screen. So I'm not really thinking he's the right guy, again, for this project. He just has no real confidence as a writer or a director, and the only reason why he's gotten far in Hollywood is because he presents a lot of bootlicks on screen, like the Anthony Anderson character on Blackish, the character on Black AF, who is just a scared brother. This makes him a very popular person with all the white racists in Hollywood on the left, and he's sitting there. They want to get him to do The Wizard of Oz, passively giving him the biggest project of his career, but aggressively, I can see how they're setting him up for failure, because if this movie winds up failing, and I believe it would fail, just like The Heights and just like West Side Story, because the material is just too old, they would say, oh, there's no audience for black fantasy. And again, this ties right into what they're trying to do to destroy black fantasy. They want to create a series of flops to try to sabotage the growing black fantasy market that is being built up by brothers like myself and many others who create comic books, science fiction novels, and fantasy novels. Many of us want to go out here and create a larger marketplace for black people to imagine themselves in, and what they want to do is recruit a bootleg like a Kenya Barris, just like they recruited Ava DuVernay to create The Wrinkle in Time. And what they want to do is ball up the black fantasy market and throw it in the trash so that black people won't be able to imagine themselves in a world where they see themselves first, where we see our value as people, and we go out here and want to create a world where we can be the ones in charge. So when I look at, again, your Kenya Barris, they're just using this agent to go out here and, again, destroy the black fantasy market. And they want to destroy it because, again, they don't want black people to imagine themselves in a world where they see themselves first and see themselves doing great things. No, they want to go out here and have you thinking, oh, we're making a Wizard of Oz, but the only magic in that film is voodoo, and that voodoo is meant to try to boggle a black person's mind into believing that that these people want to make, again, a great film with black people in a remake. But the whole thing is, why should we go out here and be a part of a remade film when we can go out here and be in a fresh concept like A Temptation of John Haynes or many of the other great black fantasy concepts out there? Why should you just sit there and be in some white guy's story when you can be in your own story yourself? So when I look at this whole Kenya Barris being announced to write and direct The Wizard of Oz, this is not really something I'm really happy about, because it's, again, when you look at the bigger picture of the chessboard, this is just not a good look for black people, and it's not going to work well for us in the long term. Now, if you want to pick up some of my positive black fantasy on the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, The Temptation of John Haynes, The Man Who Rules the World, and many of the books in the Spinsterella trilogy, you can find all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, All About Nikki, a fabulous first season. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air meets Clueless in this absolutely fabulous African-American 1990s teen sitcom. Get all 13 episodes of All About Nikki, the fabulous first season, in paperback and e-readers today.